Hello beautiful people and welcome, to a video on the standard selector. It is the anniversary, and for the anniversary, we get to pick a standard character. Wow, how generous. Thank you, Hoyoverse. This character will make all the difference in my attempts at clearing latest endgame contents to do onslaught. Can't wait to go play Tighnari and definitely clear Fearless difficulty in time. Anyways, let's talk about the standard characters, and maybe more than the standard characters, let's talk about Masterless Stella Fortuna and level 100. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna tier list. I do think the tier list format will be helpful for this. I want to include a Traveler as a placeholder for picking a constellation on a character you already have at C6. First, let's talk about the value of each of these at C0. Obtaining most of these characters is outright worthless. These characters will not make your best teams if you're focusing on meta. I would say there are two characters in this list that could make your best teams in some scenarios. Those two characters will be Mona and Dehya. Dehya as an off-field power applicator when you need defensive utility. Mona as one of the viable options in a Skirk team and to some extent in the Flynn's team. Neither of these characters is important in any real scenario, so selecting them just for that to me is a bit iffy of a choice, but they are usable. The other characters, Diluc can be played in plunge teams, but that's not a Diluc team. Pretty much anyone can do it, and he's not even the best at it. The Cryo Claymores, I'm pretty sure both Remine and Ella are actually better than he is at Pyro Plunge. That's because Diluc's burst is completely worthless. It's an incredibly long animation with a bunch of pyro application, so it kind of prevents you from melting, and the infusion doesn't last long enough that you can do it at the start of your setup, which means you don't use his burst at all in the plunge teams, and you just rely on Bennett Pyro Infusion. And if you're doing that, the character doesn't need to be Pyro, and the crowd characters' kits just are better, despite Diluc's slightly higher plunge multiplier. As it turns out, being able to do one more melt from the fact that you can apply Cryo with your skill matters more than a slightly higher multiplier. If you really like Diluc, you can select him, but just in terms of like actually playing a character in endgame content on a meta-focused account, he will never make your teams. Keqing, unfortunately, just does not compete with the latest characters. She's usable. Electro carries as a whole can always get carried by Hyper Bloom, but she's not the best. Jean, VV healer, isn't completely worthless to have, but so many characters are either getting forced into very specific team building criteria that prevents you from using VV, or don't want Farina, so the healing is less valuable. Jean's value is just not really very high nowadays. Qiqi, with out of the guild, come as a surprise to anyone. Qiqi was never all that useful. Glor. She's basically just bad Sucrose, but she can only really be played in one of Sucrose's roles, so she's just pretty awful. She's got a little bit of healing, but it's not enough to matter. I will say though, out of the characters that are here, out of the characters that you actually spend time on field, if I was forced to play one of these in their optimal teams, focus on like on fielding them, the one I would choose over the other ones is definitely Glor, because Animo drivers can get carried by Inefa. Even if you don't have Inefa, you can get carried by like Fischl or on whatever. But then there's also the fact that Aoife exists, and Aoife kind of just does the same thing as she does, so there's no reason to go for her ever. And then Tighnari has a cool design, he's got a cool kit, and his numbers are ass, so he's just not very good. Now, outside of their value at C0, what about with constellations? Are there any of these characters that have relevant constellation breakpoints at which they become decent? So first, for now, we'll exclude these. Let's go through these and talk about the characters who do not have a constellation breakpoint that is actually useful. The first one I want to talk about is actually Glor, because her constellations are not bad. The problem is, the purpose of her constellations is to improve the swirl focus teams, and even at C6 Glor, those swirl focus teams are significantly worse than other meta teams. And so despite her constellations being pretty good for her personal damage, they're pretty worthless to an account. So to me, a character like Glor, pretty much never really worth considering from a meta perspective. If it's a character you like and you want to C6 them because you like them, don't listen to me. Next, Diluc. Diluc C1 is 15 damage percent to enemies above 50% HP. Diluc C2 is 10% attack when it gets hit, up to 3 stacks. If you get hit, I guess this is not completely worthless. But C3 to C6 don't do anything for plunge playstyle, which is realistically the only way you should consider playing Diluc. And like I said at the start, he doesn't really provide any value for you. Next, Keqing. Keqing isn't that good to begin with, and her constellations are honestly kind of pathetic. All of her constellations are somewhat useful, but none of them is very useful. And so the gap between C0 and C6 Keqing is not that big. And on top of that, Keqing is not even that big of a portion of her team DPS in her teams anyways. And then the last character that doesn't have a relevant constellation breakpoint is Qiqi. Self-explanatory. I don't think we need to get into this. So these 4 characters are, in my opinion, the characters that you should never consider getting just for the sake of what their kid does. Now we can talk about the remaining 4 characters who can potentially have some form of usage. I'd say that the least recommended here, in my opinion, is Jean. Jean's C4 is 40% animal resistance shred. There's a problem though. 1, it doesn't have a duration. It's just tied to the burst duration, and it doesn't linger after the burst is gone. Jean's burst duration is 10 seconds, which is very short. There's quite a few carries that have uptime longer than 10 seconds. When you look at animal carries, they actually all do, which means you're not full uptime. And on top of that, you have to swap into her right before your carry, which means less buff uptime for your other buffs. On top of that, since it doesn't linger, it only shreds enemies inside the burst, which means if the enemies step outside, if they get knocked back by the burst, which does have knockback, if they get hit by the burst, which staggers them backwards, which it does do, right, the burst damage over time at the edge of the field, they don't get shredded anymore. Jean C4 is like the fakest constellation in the game. Like, it says it has 40% shred, but in practice, it's like 10% average shred. It's not actually good. Now, it is still usable, especially for people who don't have Farazan cons. They don't have access to a good shredder for Anemo, so this is somewhat usable. Also, if we ever get more Anemo damage dealers in the future, it could get some value from that. The biggest problem is that unless you absolutely need the healing, it's still way worse than even C0 Farazan. But it is not completely useless, and that's what she's got going for her. That's pretty much it. Next, Mona. We've already talked about how Mona C0 is a character that is somewhat useful in some teams. On top of that, Mona has some constellations that are not completely worthless, and because unlike a lot of these other 5-star characters, she's usable in teams already at C0, the fact that she has okay constellations, even if they're not very good, matters. Mona's C1 is kind of fake. It increases the damage of hydro-related reactions by 15%. It says it increases frozen duration. It does not do that. It's been bugged since 1.0. They have never fixed it. It has never done anything. But it does increase the damage of hydro-related reaction by 15%. This is not multiplicative. This is additive to the EM multiplier, which means that in a lunar charge team with Inefa or with Flynn's, this is like 4-5% increase to your reaction damage. One nice thing about this is that this lasts longer than the Omen does. The reaction bonus lasts for 8 seconds after you hit an opponent affected by an Omen, which means it's basically the Omen's duration, which is 5 seconds, plus 8. Her C2, 3, 5, 6 are completely worthless. Bad, don't bother. And C4 is 15 crit rate against enemies affected by Omen. I think the C4 tends to be a little bit overrated because people forget that the Omen duration is not very long. Sure, you can extend the duration in freeze teams against freezable enemies because the duration doesn't start counting down until the bubble pops, and the bubble cannot pop on frozen enemies because the trigger condition for the bubble to pop is that they take poise damage, which effectively means they get hit by an attack that has the ability to stagger them, but enemies that are frozen are immune to poise damage. So until they get unfrozen, the bubble will not pop. And so the 5-second timer will not start. But you will have the damage bonus. But against freezable enemies, because they're immune to freeze, well, you can't Omen extend anymore. So it's only 5 seconds. And so most of the time, this 15 crit rate only affects a fairly small portion of your carry's damage window and is only actually equivalent to like 5%. It's definitely not fake like Jean C4, but it's also incredibly small of an upgrade. So it's not all that important to get. And next we have, I guess we can start with Tighnari. Tighnari's constellations from C1 to C5 are not very good. 15 crit rate is not bad, but it's not that big of a deal. 20 dendro damage bonus, not great. Also because the 15 crit rate only applies to half of his damage, the part from his charge attack. Then burst level, it's okay, but it doesn't affect his spread damage, only the talent portion of his damage. 120 EM, it's okay. The fact it buffs the team is a bit nice, but really Yeah, a skill level, talent level is completely worthless. And then C6 is a massive deal. Tighnari's C6 gives each of his charge attacks one additional hit, but that one additional hit does not share ICD, so it triggers an additional reaction. And also does a little bit more damage than the other hits. That already is kind of a nice thing, but on top of that, it also decreases the charge time. Now, decreasing the charge time effectively means that you can do this. Oops. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really do it all that well, but you can basically get all 3 shots out in just a few frames if you're good, which shortens his field time. Otherwise, you need to do this. Because you have to actually wait until the Luster Bloom arrow like properly forms. But also, it means that your non-E charge attack charges up more quickly. C6 Tighnari teams actually sometimes do use additional charge attacks to fill downtime. And it actually matters even more for those charge attacks than it does for the E-enhanced ones. All that together makes Tighnari C6 a pretty massive increase to his personal damage. Problem is, his personal damage is ass to begin with. So even with this, he still doesn't even compete with like modern carries. But he's actually not that far behind at C6. I would say that if you have C5 Tighnari and you can consider getting him at C6 from that, he'll actually be usable as a Dendro carry for Dendro-focused content. Even if you don't have him get hard carried by the rest of his team doing all the hard work in a Hyper Bloom team. I think the biggest problem with Tighnari is that the gap between C0 and C5 is not very big. He just has a one big spike at C6, which means that along the way, constellations along the way don't feel good to get. Because of that, I actually kind of like him less than Mona on the Selector. And the last character, Dehya. And Dehya's a really interesting one. Unlike Tighnari, Dehya's constellations along the way to C6 aren't that bad. They're not that big damage increases, but I mean, the C1 is an okay-ish damage increase. It's like, alright. The C2 is nice for the utility it gives. She actually, when you play her as a damage dealer, is a talent scaling character, so the talent constellation is not completely worthless like Tighnari's is. The C4 is really big for her ER requirements if you play her as a carry. And then the C6 is, just like Tighnari's, a very big deal. Now the difference is that Dehya's kit doesn't lend itself well to like multi-carry teams with a lot of different damage dealers like Tighnari's kit does. So the fact that she's a pretty bad carry to begin with is more impactful to the power of her teams. In other words, while the increase from C0 to C6 on Dehya is bigger than it is on Tighnari, that doesn't mean that she's that good at C6. I will say, spread-focused Dendro carries have not received much in the way of like external support since the release of Dendro. They don't have the sort of very powerful synergy supports that Pyro characters have received. Because of that, a C6 Dehya is actually pretty decent. Not quite to the point that it would beat out Maoika, but to the point that it would be competitive, if not better than the other Natlan carries at C6. More importantly though, unlike Tighnari, Dehya is a character that is somewhat useful even if you don't have her at C6. Obviously not as a carry, you won't want to play her as a carry without C6, but she is somewhat useful. So I would put her above Tighnari in terms of value, but not that far above. I think I'd still put her below Mona. Now you might have noticed if you're a very observant individual. The Def. You've got 4 characters in the D tier, 1 character in the C tier, and 3 characters in the B tier, and nothing in the A and S tier, and you've gone through all the standard characters. Well, yeah. The reason for that is because if what you're focused on is the meta, your best choice by far, bar none, no question about it, is to just progress towards Masterless Stella Fortuna. Pick the character that has the highest current constellation so you can get as close to C6 as possible, so that on the next Selector, you can pick a character that's already C6 and get a Masterless Stella Fortuna to level 95, your favorite carry. Alright, I've talked about the increase from Mona's cons, right? I want to contextualize that. The increase from getting a carry to level 95 is bigger than the increase from getting Mona's C1 in the teams that care about Mona's C1. And Mona's C1 is arguably the most useful upgrade to a meta team that you can have out of all of these. And so, just in terms of meta, by far the best option, pretty much for everyone, is to just pick the character that gets you closest to those Masterless Scylla Fortunas. Now, there is a potential problem here, which is if you're a relatively newer player, you probably don't have any character that's close, right? Maybe your highest is C1 or C2. And if that's the case, it'll take you a while to get to C6, and to the C7, you would need to get your first Masterless Scylla Fortuna. Right, if your current highest is C2, you can get one from the Selector, one from the Constellation Selector, you'll be at C4, but that means 3 years until you get your first Masterless Scylla Fortuna. In the next 3 years, it is very possible that they release another standard character that you will want to get more than you will want to get the Masterless Scylla Fortuna. And if they do, that's plus 1 year. And if they release 2, that's plus 2 years. And if their constellations are useful, all that progress is basically wasted. So take it with a grain of salt. If you're not close to any of them yet, maybe it's not worth doing for you. Personally, I'm a little bit torn because just in terms of meta, getting characters to level 100 is nice. But if I get my characters to level 100, it kind of makes it harder to do equalized testing. So I'm not sure I will want to. I think the more I think about it, especially because I already have 2 from Keqing being deeply and thoroughly in love with my account. Since the Constellation Selector gets you one constellation of your choice like 4 times a year, and you can't select the same one multiple times, it's basically guaranteed that I'll select Keqing at some point here, which means I'll have 3, which will be enough to get 1 character to level 100. So I would probably get my Varessa to level 100 because I'm a Varessa main, and then I don't really want to get my supports to level 100, and I don't really care about getting other carries to level 100. They nerfed they nerfed transformative reaction scalings above level 90. The increase from 90 to 100 is now about 15% instead of 40. So it's not like the massive increase that it would have been. So I don't really have a desire to level 100 my Raiden anymore. And so because of that, and because I already have the 3 that I need to 100 my main, I think I'm just gonna select Dehya. And it's not really for meta reason, it's just because Dehya is my favorite character on the banner, and I think it'd be nice if I could get her at C6 at some point. And at the end of the day, I recommend you do the same, not as in selecting Dehya, but just selecting the character you want to get, right? If you're someone who doesn't care that much about any of them, getting a Masterless Scylla Fortuna or getting close to that so you can level up your favorite character might be your best way to do something that's just for fun. If you're someone who actually cares about using either Tighnari or Dehya, getting their cons so you can get closer to them being in an actually usable state could be nice. But other than that, it doesn't really matter that much. Also, for level 100 stuff, I don't really want to make a video dedicated to that, so I'll just quickly mention this here. There is no character that gets a massive upgrade from level 100. The characters that get the largest amount generally hover around 10% personal DPS. The one that gets the highest is probably Molani out of those I calced. And it's not because she's an HP scaler, by the way. It's because she is a character who doesn't really buff her main stat scaling externally, and who does a large majority of the team DPS. But pretty much every character gets a similar increase. It's between like 5 and 10% personal DPS, with Hyper Bloom triggers being 15 instead, so those are a little bit more. But Hyper Bloom triggers are never the large majority of the team DPS. At best, it's like 70% of the team DPS, which means a bit less than 10% of a team DPS upgrade, which is similar to the hyper carries. So it's basically always somewhere between like 5 and 10%. But yeah, as usual, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.